The announcement crackled over the airport speakers. Final call for Flight 127 to Lagos. Please proceed to Gate 6. Jane stood frozen in place, clutching the denial letter in her trembling hands. She couldn't breathe. The words on the page blurred through her tears, but the meaning was clear. Her work visa renewal had been denied. She had no choice but to return home after 7 long years abroad. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. What would her mother say? How would she face her old neighbors? The weight of her unfulfilled dreams pressed down on her chest like an iron vice. As the gate agent called her name for boarding, Jane reluctantly moved forward, dragging her small suitcase behind her. The suitcase felt heavier than it was, not because of the few belongings inside, but because it carried the crushing weight of her shame. When she finally sat down in her seat, she gazed out of the airplane window. The city she had left behind all those years ago was no longer a home she could return to proudly. It was now a reminder of everything she had failed to achieve. The plane took off, but Jane's mind was stuck in the past. Every sacrifice she had made, every sleepless night she had endured abroad, suddenly seemed meaningless. Her hands gripped the armrest as she whispered to herself, "I've disappointed everyone. I've disappointed myself." The plane ascended into the clouds, and with it, Jane's hope of escaping her reality disappeared. The city lights sparkled below as the plane descended, but Jane couldn't bring herself to look at them. She pressed her forehead against the cold window, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. The hum of the plane's engines seemed to echo the chaos in her mind. For 7 years, she had lived abroad, chasing a dream she had painted so vividly in her mind. It was supposed to be the kind of dream her late father would have been proud of, one filled with accomplishments, financial stability, and stories of triumph to tell back home. But now, all she carried with her were scars of failure and the shame of returning empty-handed. Her father's face appeared in her mind, stern yet kind. He had been the one who encouraged her to take the leap, to go abroad and build a better life. "Jane, you're my shining star," he had said the night she left, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Make us proud." Those words had been her guiding light for years, pushing her through endless hours of work and countless moments of doubt. But now, they were a heavy chain around her neck. She closed her eyes, and memories from her childhood played like an old film. Her father, sitting at the head of the dining table, talking about his dreams for his children. "Education is the key," he would say. "Opportunities don't come to those who wait. You have to chase them." Jane had believed him, had carried his wisdom with her across oceans. But what had she done with those opportunities? Squandered them, she thought bitterly. Her mother's voice pulled her from the spiral of guilt. It was a memory of the last phone call they had shared. "Jane, you've been gone so long. When are you coming home?" There had been a mixture of longing and unspoken worry in her tone, as if she had sensed Jane's struggles even when Jane tried to hide them. "I'm working on it, Mama," Jane had replied, forcing a cheerful tone. "Just a little longer." But time had run out. Now, Jane dreaded facing her mother's disappointed eyes. The plane touched down with a jolt, and Jane gripped the armrests. Her heart sank deeper as she realized she had arrived. There was no more running from the truth. At the baggage claim, she stood silently as other passengers greeted loved ones with laughter and embraces. She watched a young woman, who had clearly been living abroad as well, hand over gifts to her family, their smiles wide with pride. Jane's suitcase, with its worn edges and broken zipper, looked pathetic by comparison. When her suitcase finally appeared, she grabbed it and headed toward the exit. The sliding doors opened to reveal the city she had once called home. It was vibrant and chaotic, just as she remembered, but it felt different now, like a place she no longer belonged to. Standing at the curb was her mother, a small figure wrapped in a colorful scarf. Her face lit up when she saw Jane, and she waved eagerly. Jane's chest tightened as she approached. She braced herself for the inevitable questions, for the disappointment her mother would try to hide. But when she reached her, her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "Welcome home, my daughter," she said softly. Jane wanted to crumble right there, to confess everything. The failures, the rejections, the shame, but her throat closed up. Instead, she managed a weak smile and whispered, It's good to be home, Mama. They rode in silence most of the way back. The city outside the car window was alive with honking horns, street vendors calling out their wares, and the hum of life in motion. Jane felt none of it. She was too consumed by the weight of her own thoughts. When they reached home, the small, familiar house stood waiting. Its chipped paint and creaky gate were unchanged, but to Jane, it looked smaller than before, like her memories had exaggerated its size. Inside, her mother had prepared a meal. The aroma of spices filled the air, a scent Jane hadn't realized she missed until that moment. They sat at the table, her mother's eyes watching her with quiet concern. "You don't have to say anything tonight," her mother finally said, breaking the silence. "Rest first. Tomorrow, we'll talk." Jane nodded, grateful but uneasy. She went to her old room, which her mother had kept just as it was, complete with the faded posters on the walls and the bookshelf lined with her childhood favorites. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Jane let the tears come. She cried for her father, for the dreams she had failed to achieve, and for the crushing weight of expectation that still lingered, even in his absence. "I'm sorry, Papa," she whispered into the darkness. "I've let you down. I've let everyone down." As the city outside bustled on, Jane stared at the ceiling, wondering how she would ever find the strength to face the days ahead. The next morning, Jane woke to the familiar sound of street vendors calling out their wares. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the cracked ceiling. The feeling of dread lingered, a knot in her stomach that tightened with every passing second. The faint clatter of dishes reminded her that her mother was awake. With a sigh, Jane got up and splashed cold water on her face, hoping it would wash away the fatigue and self-pity. She dressed in simple clothes and went to the kitchen, where her mother was busy preparing breakfast. Her mother turned with a warm smile. "Good morning, my daughter. Did you sleep well?" Jane nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yes, Mama. Thank you. Come, sit down. I made your favorite." Her mother set a plate of steaming akara and pap in front of her. The aroma triggered a flood of memories. Early mornings before school, her father sitting at the table with a newspaper, and the three of them sharing meals filled with laughter and plans for the future. Jane's throat tightened, but she forced herself to take a bite. Her mother sat across from her, sipping tea. "You've lost weight," she said gently. "Life must have been hard over there." Jane didn't know how to respond. She wanted to open up, to tell her mother everything, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said, "It wasn't easy." Her mother reached across the table and placed a hand on hers. "You're home now. That's all that matters." But was it? Jane wasn't so sure. After breakfast, Jane decided to step outside. The neighborhood was just as she remembered. Children playing in the streets, women chatting by their stalls, and the occasional motorcycle zooming past. But now, everything felt different. As she walked down the street, she noticed familiar faces, old neighbors who had watched her grow up. She caught snippets of their conversations as she passed. "Is that Jane? She's back? 7 years abroad, and she comes back with nothing? I heard she couldn't make it. Such a shame." Jane quickened her pace, her cheeks burning with shame. She had always imagined returning home with her head held high, her success evident in the way she carried herself. Instead, she felt like a shadow of her former self, avoiding eye contact and pretending not to hear the whispers. She turned a corner and found herself standing in front of the local grocery store. The owner, Mr. Ade, looked up from his counter and smiled. "Jane, is that you?" "Hello, Mr. Ade," she said, forcing a smile. "It's been so long. You've been abroad? How was it?" Jane hesitated. "It was an experience." Good. It's always good to see our children go abroad and succeed. You've made us proud." Jane felt a lump in her throat. She nodded, mumbled an excuse, and left the store as quickly as she could. By the time she reached home, she was trembling. Her mother noticed immediately. "Jane, what's wrong?" Jane sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "Mama, they're all talking about me. They're all judging me. I can't face them." Her mother sat beside her, pulling her into a hug. "Let them talk, Jane. They don't know your story. They don't know the strength it took to survive." "But I failed," Jane whispered, her voice breaking. "I went abroad to make you proud, to make Papa proud, and I came back with nothing. I'm a disappointment." Her mother cupped Jane's face, forcing her to look into her eyes. "You are not a disappointment. Do you hear me? You are my daughter, and I am proud of you. Not because of what you've done or haven't done, but because of who you are. Life is not a straight road, Jane. Sometimes we stumble. What matters is that we get back up." Tears streamed down Jane's face. She wanted to believe her mother's words, but the weight of her failure was too heavy. That night, as she lay in bed, Jane stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had to do something. She couldn't let her story end like this. But where would she even begin? Her eyes drifted to her suitcase in the corner of the room. Inside was the envelope containing the letter she had written to herself 7 years ago. The letter outlining all her dreams and goals. She hadn't dared to open it since her return. With trembling hands, she got up, unzipped the suitcase, and pulled out the envelope. She stared at it for a long moment before finally tearing it open. The words on the page felt like a punch to the gut. "I will make my family proud. I will build a life filled with purpose and success. I will come back home as an example of what hard work can achieve." Jane folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She had failed every single promise she had made to herself, but as the night wore on, a tiny spark ignited within her, a stubborn flicker of determination. She had fallen, yes, but maybe her mother was right. Maybe she could still get back up. She didn't know how or where to start, but one thing was clear. She wasn't ready to give up just yet. The next morning, Jane woke up feeling an unfamiliar mix of heaviness and resolve. The letter she had read the night before sat on her bedside table, its words etched into her mind. She couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could rewrite her future. The house was quiet. Her mother had gone to the market, leaving Jane alone with her thoughts. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the suitcase she had yet to fully unpack. For a moment, she debated leaving it untouched, as if keeping it closed could somehow shield her from the reality it represented. But then, with a deep breath, she pulled it toward her and began sorting through its contents. Folded clothes, a few worn shoes, and a handful of trinkets from her time abroad. There wasn't much. But then her hand brushed against something unfamiliar. It was a small, sealed envelope tucked into a side pocket. She frowned, pulling it out and examining it. The handwriting on the front was her father's. Her heart skipped a beat. How had she not noticed this before? The envelope was old, its edges slightly yellowed, but her father's handwriting was unmistakable. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in his neat script. "Dear Jane, if you're reading this, it means life hasn't gone the way you planned. I don't know what challenges you're facing, but I want you to remember something important. Success is not measured by the trophies on your shelf or the money in your bank account. It's measured by your ability to keep moving forward, even when the world tries to hold you back. You're my daughter, Jane, and I've always believed in you. Don't let the weight of other people's expectations crush your spirit. Life will test you, but it's your resilience that will define you. Whatever happens, know that I'm proud of you, not for what you achieve, but for who you are. With love, Papa." The letter blurred as tears filled Jane's eyes. She clutched it to her chest, her father's words washing over her like a balm on an open wound. He had known, somehow he had known, that she would need this reminder. For the first time since returning home, Jane felt a flicker of hope. Her father's faith in her hadn't wavered, even when hers had. She read the letter again and again, each word sinking deeper into her soul. It didn't erase the pain or the shame she felt, but it gave her something she hadn't had in a long time: permission to forgive herself. The sound of the front door opening startled her. She quickly wiped her tears and tucked the letter back into the envelope as her mother walked into the room, carrying a bag of groceries. "Jane, are you all right?" her mother asked, noticing her red eyes. "I'm fine, Mama," Jane said, her voice steadier than she expected. Her mother set the bag down and sat beside her. "I saw Mrs. Obina at the market today. She asked about you. People are curious, you know." Jane tensed, but her mother placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Let them talk," she said firmly. Their words don't define you. What matters is what you do next. Her mother's words mirrored the sentiment in her father's letter, and Jane felt a surge of determination. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but she knew she couldn't stay in this state forever. I think I need to take a walk, Jane said, standing up. Her mother nodded. Take your time, my daughter. And remember, you're stronger than you think. As Jane stepped out into the bustling streets, the city felt slightly less suffocating. Her father's letter burned in her pocket, a quiet reminder that she still had something to offer, even if she didn't know what it was yet. She wandered aimlessly, her feet carrying her to a part of the neighborhood she hadn't visited in years. It was a quiet street lined with small shops, one of which caught her eye. It was an old bookstore with a faded sign that read Stories Untold. The name resonated with her. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The store smelled of old paper and wood, and the shelves were crammed with books of all sizes and genres. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with glasses perched on his nose. He looked up and smiled. "Welcome," he said warmly. "Looking for something specific?" Jane hesitated. "Not really. I just felt like coming in." The man nodded, as if he understood. "Sometimes, the stories we need find us." She browsed the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines of books. One caught her attention, a small, worn book titled Starting Over, A Guide to Finding Yourself. She pulled it from the shelf and flipped through its pages. It wasn't just a book of advice. It was filled with personal stories of people who had faced failure and rebuilt their lives. Jane bought the book and left the store, feeling a spark of inspiration. Maybe her story wasn't over yet. Maybe it was just beginning. That evening, Jane sat in the dim light of her room, the book she'd bought resting on her lap. The title, Starting Over, A Guide to Finding Yourself, seemed to glow in the faint light, almost as if daring her to open it. The stories inside had already begun to whisper to her during her walk home, their voices urging her to reflect on her own journey. As she turned the pages, she found herself engrossed in the tales of others who had faced failure, rejection, and loss, only to rise again with renewed purpose. Some stories spoke of financial ruin, others of shattered relationships, but all shared a common thread: resilience. One story in particular caught her attention: a woman named Clara, who had returned to her hometown after years abroad with nothing to show for it. Clara had felt the same crushing shame Jane now carried, but she had managed to rebuild her life by starting small, reconnecting with her roots, and rediscovering her passions. Jane closed the book and leaned back against the headboard. "Reconnect with your roots," she murmured to herself. What did that even mean for her? Her thoughts drifted to her late father's letter. His words echoed in her mind. Success is not measured by trophies or money. It's measured by your ability to keep moving forward. Her mother's voice broke through her reverie. "Jane, dinner is ready." Reluctantly, she set the book aside and headed to the dining room. The table was set simply, with steaming plates of rice and stew. Her mother had always found a way to make even the smallest meals feel abundant. As they ate, her mother glanced at her. "You seem deep in thought. What's on your mind?" Jane hesitated, then decided to share a little. "I bought a book today. It's about people who've faced failure and found ways to start over." Her mother smiled. "That sounds like something you need right now." Jane nodded. One of the stories was about a woman who went back to her roots. "I was thinking, maybe I should try something like that. I just don't know where to start." Her mother set her fork down and looked at Jane thoughtfully. "Do you remember the community center your father used to take you to? The one where he helped organize reading sessions for the children?" Jane blinked, the memory rushing back. Her father had always been passionate about education, often volunteering his time to teach underprivileged kids in the neighborhood. She had gone with him a few times as a child, sitting in the corner while he read stories to a room full of eager faces. "I haven't thought about that place in years," Jane admitted. "It's still there," her mother said. "They've struggled to keep it running, though. Maybe that's a place where you can start." Jane wasn't sure how she felt about the idea. On one hand, it seemed almost too simple, too small. On the other, the thought of giving back in some way stirred something inside her, a flicker of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice cautious but not dismissive. Her mother smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Take your time, Jane. But remember, the first step is always the hardest." Later that night, as she lay in bed, Jane couldn't shake the idea of the community center. Her mind drifted back to those afternoons with her father, the way his face lit up when the children laughed at his stories. She remembered the joy in their eyes, the way they hung on his every word. Could she find that kind of joy again? The thought lingered as she drifted off to sleep, her father's voice echoing softly in her dreams. "You're my shining star." The next morning, Jane stood outside the community center, her nerves threatening to get the better of her. The building was older than she remembered, its paint peeling and windows smudged with dust. But the sound of children's laughter from inside reminded her of its purpose. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door. Inside, the scene was both familiar and foreign. A group of children sat in a circle, their attention focused on a young woman reading a story aloud. The shelves, once filled with books, now held only a few tattered volumes. The walls, once decorated with colorful posters, were bare. The woman looked up as Jane entered, her expression curious but welcoming. "Can I help you?" Jane hesitated, then said, "My name is Jane. I used to come here with my father years ago. I was wondering if you might need any help." The woman's face brightened. "We can always use help. My name is Aisha. I've been trying to keep this place running, but it's been tough." Jane nodded, glancing around. "I'd like to volunteer, if that's okay." "Of course. We could use someone to help with the reading sessions and maybe organize the books. Are you good with kids?" Jane smiled faintly. "I used to be." Aisha laughed. "That's good enough for me. Let's start small. Why don't you join the next session?" As Jane settled into the corner of the room, watching the children listen intently to the story, she felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't the grand success she had once dreamed of, but it was something meaningful, something real. And for the first time in years, Jane felt a glimmer of hope that she could rebuild her life, one step at a time. The first few days at the community center were more challenging than Jane had anticipated. The children were lively, sometimes too lively, and the limited resources made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. Still, there was something about the center that drew her back each day. She started small, helping to tidy up the dusty shelves and assisting Aisha with organizing the sessions. By the end of the first week, Jane found herself leading a storytime session. She chose a simple tale, one her father had once read to her, and tried her best to mimic his warmth and enthusiasm. At first, the children were restless, but as Jane settled into the rhythm of the story, they began to quiet down. Their wide eyes and curious expressions reminded her of why her father had loved this place so much. When the session ended, a little girl with pigtails tugged at Jane's sleeve. "Miss Jane, will you read to us again tomorrow?" Jane smiled, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. "Of course, if you'd like me to." The girl beamed and skipped away, leaving Jane with a feeling she hadn't experienced in years: fulfillment. That evening, as she walked home, Jane reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The whispers in the neighborhood still followed her, but they felt less sharp now. Each day at the community center gave her a renewed sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. When she reached home, her mother greeted her with a smile. "You look different," she said as she handed Jane a cup of tea. Jane raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Lighter," her mother said. "Like a burden has been lifted." Jane sipped her tea thoughtfully. I think I've found something worth doing." Her mother's smile widened. "I'm glad to hear that. Your father would be proud." The mention of her father brought a lump to Jane's throat, but this time, it wasn't accompanied by the crushing guilt she'd grown used to. Instead, it was a bittersweet reminder of the man who had always believed in her. Despite the small victories at the community center, doubts began to creep in. Was this really enough? She had spent 7 years abroad chasing dreams of success and wealth, only to return home with empty hands. One evening, Jane sat in her room, staring at the book she'd bought, starting over. She flipped through its pages, hoping for guidance. One passage caught her eye. "Rebuilding a life is not about recreating the one you lost. It's about embracing the person you've become and finding new ways to move forward." The words struck a chord, but they also stirred an ache in her chest. Was she truly embracing who she had become, or was she simply settling for less? The following day, her doubts intensified when she overheard a conversation outside the center. Two women stood near the entrance, speaking in hushed tones. She's back, and she's volunteering here? Is that all she has to show for her time abroad? It's sad, really. 7 years, and she couldn't even find a way to succeed. The words hit Jane like a blow. She clenched her fists, resisting the urge to confront them. Instead, she turned and walked into the center, her mind racing. Inside, Aisha noticed her tense demeanor. "Are you okay, Jane?" Jane hesitated, then forced a smile. "I'm fine, just tired." But she wasn't fine. The whispers and doubts gnawed at her throughout the day, making it hard to focus. By the time she got home, she felt completely drained. Her mother noticed immediately. "What's wrong, Jane?" Jane slumped into a chair, her head in her hands. "Mama, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'll ever feel like I've achieved anything. People keep talking about me, and it's like their words are a constant reminder of my failures." Her mother sat beside her, taking her hand. "Jane, do you know why people talk about you?" Jane shook her head. "It's because they're afraid to look at their own lives. It's easier to focus on someone else's struggles than to face their own. You can't let their words define you." "But what if they're right?" Jane whispered. "What if I'm just fooling myself?" Her mother's grip on her hand tightened. "You're not fooling yourself. You're rebuilding, Jane. And rebuilding takes time. Don't let impatience or other people's opinions steal your progress." Her mother's words stayed with her that night as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She didn't have all the answers, but she realized she couldn't let the opinions of others dictate her path. If she was going to rebuild her life, she had to do it on her own terms. The next day brought an unexpected twist. As Jane was helping Aisha sort through a box of donated books, a man walked into the center. He was in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a confident air about him. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice filling the room. "Is this the community center?" Aisha nodded. "Yes, it is. How can we help you?" "I'm looking for someone to collaborate with on a literacy program," the man explained. "My name is Mr. Bello. I run an NGO that focuses on education in underserved communities." Jane perked up at the mention of education. Mr. Bello continued, "I heard about this place from a colleague. I'm impressed that it's still running despite the challenges." Aisha smiled. "We do what we can, but it hasn't been easy." Mr. Bello glanced at Jane. "And you are?" Jane stepped forward, feeling a mix of nerves and curiosity. "I'm Jane. I've been volunteering here for a few weeks." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's rare to see someone so dedicated. Would you be interested in working on a larger project? We're planning to expand our literacy programs, and I think you could bring valuable insight." Jane blinked, caught off guard. "Me? I don't know if I'm qualified." "Nonsense," Mr. Bello said with a smile. "Passion and experience matter more than qualifications. Think about it, and let me know." As he left, Jane felt a spark of excitement mingled with apprehension. Was this the opportunity she had been waiting for, or was it another challenge she wasn't ready to face? For the first time in a long while, the future felt like a blank canvas, waiting for her to paint her story anew. Jane sat at the edge of her bed that night, her mind spinning with thoughts of Mr. Bello's proposal. The idea of working on a literacy program for underserved communities tugged at her heartstrings, but it also filled her with doubt. Could she really take on such a responsibility? Was she ready to step into something bigger than the small comfort zone she had carved out at the community center? The morning sun streaming through her window didn't bring any clarity. If anything, the light only sharpened the questions swirling in her mind. After breakfast, she found herself pacing the living room while her mother watched her quietly. "You've been restless all morning," her mother finally said. "What's on your mind?" Jane paused, her hands wringing nervously. "Mama, you remember Mr. Bello, the man who came to the center yesterday?" Her mother nodded. "Of course. He seemed impressed with you. He offered me a chance to work on a literacy program with his NGO," Jane explained. "It's a big opportunity, but I don't know if I'm ready for something like that." Her mother set down her knitting and looked at Jane intently. "What's holding you back?" Jane sighed, sinking into the couch. "I'm afraid, Mama. What if I fail? What if I take this chance and it turns into another disappointment? I don't think I can handle more failure." Her mother reached for her hand, her grip firm but gentle. "Jane, failure isn't the opposite of success. It's a part of it. Every step forward, whether it feels like progress or not, is a step worth taking. You've already started rebuilding your life at the community center. This is just another step." Jane stared at her mother, the words sinking in slowly. "But what if I'm not good enough?" Her mother smiled faintly. "You won't know until you try." That afternoon, Jane decided to visit the community center early. Aisha was sorting through another box of donations when Jane arrived. "You're here early," Aisha remarked with a grin. "What's on your mind?" Jane hesitated before answering. "It's about Mr. Bellow's offer. He asked if I'd be interested in working on the literacy program." Aisha's eyes lit up. "That's amazing, Jane. You should absolutely go for it." "But what if I fail?" Jane asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. Aisha set down the book she was holding and turned to face Jane. "Listen, Jane. I've been running this center on sheer willpower for years. There were times I felt like giving up, but I didn't, because I knew the work mattered. You've seen how much the children here need us. Imagine how many more you could help with Mr. Bellow's program." Jane nodded slowly. Aisha's words mirrored what her mother had said earlier. Maybe they were both right. "Do you think I'm ready for something like this?" Jane asked softly. "I think you're more ready than you realize," Aisha said with a smile. "You've already made a difference here. This is just a chance to do it on a bigger scale." Later that evening, Jane sat at her desk, staring at her phone. Mr. Bellow's number was written on a scrap of paper in front of her, and her fingers hovered over the keypad. She could hear her mother in the kitchen, humming a tune from Jane's childhood. The sound was oddly comforting, grounding her as she battled her nerves. Finally, she dialed the number. "Hello?" Mr. Bellow's voice was as warm and confident as she remembered. "Mr. Bellow, this is Jane," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about your offer, and I'd like to accept." There was a pause, and then he replied, "That's wonderful to hear, Jane. I think you'll be a valuable addition to the team. Can you meet me tomorrow to discuss the details?" "Yes, I can," Jane said, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Great. I'll send you the address. See you tomorrow." As she hung up, Jane felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, she was stepping toward something that scared her. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The next morning, Jane dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made her feel both comfortable and confident. Her mother watched her with a proud smile as she prepared to leave. "Good luck, Jane," she said, hugging her tightly. "You're going to do great." Jane nodded, holding on to her mother's encouragement as she made her way to the address Mr. Bellow had sent. The meeting was held in a modest office space in the heart of the city. Mr. Bellow greeted her warmly and introduced her to the rest of the team, a small but passionate group of people dedicated to improving literacy in underserved communities. As they discussed the program's goals and challenges, Jane found herself becoming more and more engaged. Her initial fears began to fade, replaced by a growing excitement. By the end of the meeting, Mr. Bellow handed her a folder filled with program details and said, "Welcome aboard, Jane. I think this is the start of something great." Jane left the office that day with a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Her father's words echoed in her mind as she walked home. Success is about moving forward. And that's exactly what she intended to do. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of activity for Jane. Her role in the literacy program was both demanding and exhilarating. The team worked tirelessly to organize workshops, gather resources, and recruit volunteers. Jane found herself juggling multiple responsibilities, drafting lesson plans, coordinating with local schools, and even speaking at small community gatherings to encourage parents to enroll their children in the program. Though the work was challenging, Jane felt a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't experienced in years. Every small victory, a child learning to read their first sentence, a parent expressing gratitude, or a teacher offering their support, reinforced her belief that she had made the right decision. But the road wasn't without its obstacles. One morning, the team gathered in the office for their weekly meeting. Mr. Bello began with a somber tone. "We've hit a bit of a roadblock," he said, addressing the group. "Our funding is running low, and without additional sponsors, we won't be able to continue the program beyond the next few months." A heavy silence filled the room. Jane's heart sank. The thought of the program ending so soon after it had begun was unbearable. "What can we do?" one of the team members asked. Mr. Bello sighed. "We need to secure more funding. That means reaching out to potential donors, writing proposals, and organizing fundraisers. It's going to take a collective effort." Jane felt a surge of determination. "What about the local businesses?" she suggested. "Maybe we could partner with them. Some might be willing to sponsor workshops or donate supplies." Mr. Bello nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good idea, Jane. Let's make a list of businesses and start reaching out to them." As the meeting continued, Jane volunteered to take the lead on organizing a fundraiser. It was a daunting task, but she knew it was an opportunity to prove herself, not just to the team, but to herself as well. The days that followed were some of the busiest of Jane's life. She spent hours brainstorming ideas for the fundraiser, drafting proposals, and meeting with local business owners to solicit their support. There were moments of frustration when people turned her down or seemed uninterested, but she refused to give up. Her persistence paid off when a local bookstore agreed to host the fundraiser. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Adissa, was passionate about literacy and offered to donate a percentage of her sales from the event to the program. Jane worked closely with the team to plan the event, which included book readings, a raffle, and a small exhibition showcasing the program's impact. As the date approached, she felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. On the day of the fundraiser, the bookstore buzzed with activity. Parents and children filled the aisles, browsing books and participating in the activities. Jane moved through the crowd, greeting guests and answering questions about the program. When it was her turn to speak, she stood at the front of the store, her heart pounding. Public speaking had never been her strong suit, but she knew how important this moment was. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Thank you for being here today. This program isn't just about teaching children to read, it's about giving them a chance to dream, to imagine, and to create a better future for themselves." She shared a story about one of the children at the community center, a shy boy named Samuel who had struggled with reading but was now thriving thanks to the program. As she spoke, she saw nods of understanding and encouragement from the audience. By the end of the event, the team had raised enough funds to keep the program running for another 6 months. Jane felt an overwhelming sense of relief and pride. That evening, as she walked home, Jane reflected on how far she had come. The fundraiser had been a success, but more importantly, it had shown her what she was capable of achieving when she put her mind to it. When she entered the house, her mother greeted her with a warm smile. "How did it go?" "It went well, Mama," Jane said, her exhaustion evident but her spirits high. Her mother hugged her tightly. "I'm proud of you, Jane. Your father would be too." As Jane sat down to rest, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. The shame and doubt that had once consumed her felt like distant memories. She wasn't where she had envisioned herself 7 years ago, but she was finally moving forward, and that was what mattered most. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, Jane felt ready to face whatever challenges lay in her path. For the first time in years, she truly believed in herself. The weeks following the fundraiser were a blur of activity for Jane. The literacy program had gained momentum, and she found herself busier than ever. Meetings with local educators, workshops for parents, and regular check-ins with the children were now part of her routine. Every day, it seemed, she was learning something new, not just about the program, but about herself. Her confidence was growing, but so were the demands on her time. One evening, as Jane was sorting through paperwork, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Aisha. "There's a family gathering this weekend. You should come. It's been a while since we saw you outside of work." Jane paused, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had been so immersed in the program's work that she had neglected her personal life. It had been months since she'd spent time with old friends, let alone family. After a moment of hesitation, Jane typed a quick reply. "I'll be there. Looking forward to it." The weekend arrived, and Jane found herself standing in front of Aisha's house, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The gathering was small, just a few close friends and family members, but Jane hadn't realized how much she missed these moments. As soon as she entered the house, she was greeted with smiles and hugs. The warmth of the gathering reminded her of the days when life had been simpler. Aisha's mother, Mrs. Lamy, ushered her to the kitchen. "You look different," Mrs. Lamy said as she set a plate of food in front of Jane. "Lighter, more at peace. Tell me, how's the work going?" Jane smiled, a little surprised by the observation. "It's going well. We've managed to secure some funding for the program, and we've been getting a lot of support from the community." "That's wonderful to hear," Mrs. Lamy said, her eyes sparkling. "You've always had such a big heart, Jane. I knew you'd find your way." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, and for a while, Jane was able to forget about the pressures of her new responsibilities. She chatted with friends she hadn't seen in years, laughing over old jokes and reminiscing about shared memories. At some point during the evening, Jane found herself standing on the balcony, looking out over the city. The cool breeze felt refreshing, and for the first time in a while, she allowed herself to relax. Aisha joined her, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "You okay?" she asked, handing Jane one of the glasses. Jane nodded. "Yeah, just thinking. It's been a long time since I felt like this, like I'm actually moving forward." Aisha leaned on the railing beside her. "You are. Look at everything you've accomplished. You've rebuilt your life from the ground up." "I'm still not where I thought I'd be," Jane said quietly. "I mean, 7 years abroad, and I didn't make any of the money I expected. I didn't come home with anything to show for it." Aisha sighed. "You're so hard on yourself, Jane. Success isn't just about money or accolades. You've helped so many people, and you've finally found something that feels right." Jane looked over at her, appreciating the sincerity in her friend's words. It was hard to see it for herself, but maybe Aisha was right. Maybe success didn't have to be measured by what she hadn't accomplished. As the night wore on, Jane found herself connecting with old friends in a way she hadn't expected. The conversation turned to the future, what everyone hoped for and dreamed about. When it came to Jane's turn, she hesitated. For the first time in a long while, she didn't have an immediate answer. "I'm not sure what comes next," she admitted, "but I know I'm going to keep moving forward. I think that's enough for now." Her friends nodded, some with quiet understanding, others with encouraging smiles. It wasn't the big, grand revelation she had imagined her life to be, but in that moment, Jane realized it was enough. She didn't need to have everything figured out right away. She was on the right path, and that was all that mattered. The next day, Jane returned to the community center with a renewed sense of purpose. The time spent with Aisha and her friends had reminded her of the importance of balance, of taking time for herself and appreciating the small victories along the way. At the center, the children greeted her with their usual energy, their faces lighting up when she entered. Jane smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the work she was doing. But things were about to get even more complicated. That afternoon, Mr. Bello called her into his office. He looked serious, and Jane's stomach churned with nerves. "Jane," he began, "I've just received some troubling news. One of our largest donors has decided to withdraw their support. They've encountered financial difficulties, and we're going to lose a significant portion of our funding." Jane felt a sinking feeling in her chest. This was the last thing the program needed right now. "What does this mean for the future of the program?" Jane asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're going to have to make some difficult decisions," Mr. Bello said, rubbing his temples. "I'm afraid we may have to scale back, or even halt some of our initiatives. This could affect the children we serve, and I'm not sure what the next steps are." Jane swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The program she had worked so hard for, one that had become a symbol of hope in the community, was in jeopardy. "I'll do whatever I can to help," Jane said, her voice firm despite the fear rising in her chest. "We can't let this fall apart. There has to be a way to save it." Mr. Bello looked at her with a weary but grateful expression. "I know you'll do everything you can, Jane. We'll need to start reaching out to more businesses, more donors, but we'll need to act fast." Jane nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. This wasn't the end. She had come too far to let it all fall apart now. The challenges were far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Jane felt ready to face them head-on. The news of the donor withdrawing support hit Jane like a thunderstorm, unsettling the fragile balance she had worked so hard to establish. That evening, she sat at her desk with a notebook in front of her, scribbling ideas furiously. Her mind buzzed with potential solutions, but none seemed feasible. The next morning, she arrived at the community center early, determined to tackle the problem head-on. Mr. Bello and a few team members were already there, deep in discussion. Jane joined them, her notebook in hand. "We need to explore every avenue," Jane began, flipping through her notes. "What about pitching to larger corporations? There are companies in the city with CSR budgets. Maybe they'd be willing to sponsor us." Mr. Bello nodded. "It's worth a shot, but those processes take time. We need immediate support to keep things running." "What about a crowdfunding campaign?" a team member suggested. Jane's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. We could share the success stories from the program to show people the impact we've had." The team spent the rest of the day brainstorming. By evening, they had a plan. They would approach local businesses, launch an online crowdfunding campaign, and organize another community event to raise awareness. Jane threw herself into the work. She spent hours researching companies, drafting emails, and creating profiles on crowdfunding platforms. At the same time, she worked with the team to collect testimonials from parents, children, and teachers who had benefited from the program. The stories were powerful. A young girl named Amara spoke about how learning to read had given her the confidence to dream of becoming a doctor. A single mother shared how the program had helped her son catch up in school after falling behind. These stories fueled Jane's determination to save the program. A week later, the team launched their crowdfunding campaign with a video highlighting the program's impact. Jane had spent hours editing the footage, making sure it captured the heart of their mission. The response was slow at first. A few donations trickled in, but it wasn't enough to make a significant dent in their funding gap. Jane felt a wave of frustration and doubt creeping in. One evening, as she was scrolling through social media, she stumbled upon an account for a local radio station. An idea sparked. She reached out to the station, explaining their situation and asking if they could share the campaign. To her surprise, the station agreed to feature the program in a segment. The radio interview aired the following week. Jane and Mr. Bello spoke passionately about the program's mission and the challenges they were facing. By the end of the segment, the station's phone lines were buzzing with listeners wanting to help. Donations started pouring in, and a few local businesses reached out, offering to support the program. The momentum was encouraging, but Jane knew they still had a long way to go. As the weeks passed, Jane became increasingly exhausted. Balancing her responsibilities at the community center with the relentless fundraising efforts was taking its toll. One night, as she sat at her desk, her mother entered the room with a cup of tea. "You need to rest, Jane," her mother said gently. Jane shook her head. "I can't, Mama. There's too much at stake." Her mother placed the tea on the desk and sat beside her. "I know you're carrying a heavy burden, but you can't pour from an empty cup. Take care of yourself, too." Jane sighed, feeling the weight of her mother's words. She knew she couldn't sustain this pace forever, but the thought of letting the program fail was unbearable. The next morning, Jane arrived at the community center to find a surprise waiting for her. A local philanthropist, Mrs. Ade, had heard about their campaign through the radio segment and wanted to meet the team. Mrs. Ade was a formidable woman in her 60s, known for her work in education and social development. As she toured the center, she listened intently to the team's stories and asked thoughtful questions. By the end of the visit, she turned to Mr. Bello and said, "I'm impressed by what you've built here. I'd like to help. Let's discuss how my foundation can support your program." Jane felt a surge of relief and gratitude. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Over the next few days, the team worked closely with Mrs. Ade's foundation to secure a partnership. The funding they received was enough to stabilize the program for the next year, allowing them to expand their reach and impact. For the first time in weeks, Jane allowed herself to breathe. The immediate crisis was over, but she knew there would always be challenges ahead. As she walked home that evening, the city lights twinkling around her, Jane felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She wasn't the same person who had returned home months ago, burdened by shame and doubt. She had found a purpose, a community, and a new sense of self-worth. But Jane also knew her journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, dreams to chase, and lives to touch. And she was ready for all of it.